Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Good evening to those who are joining us from Israel, and to Amir, of course, and welcome. My name is Adam Odesser. I'm director of the Dr. Stuart Lessons Israel Action Center at the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Washington, and I'd like to welcome all of you to the opening webinar of our Swords of Iron Wartime Conversations webinar series. The JCRC serves as the public affairs and community relations arm of the organized Jewish community in our nation's capital, representing more than 100 organizations and synagogues throughout our region. A key component of our work is empowering, training, and mobilizing our community to engage with and advocate for Israel, and this is especially critical during this current moment we are in. I'd like to begin by thanking all of you who are joining us today, and also thank Charlotte Barrios, our Israel Action Center Program Associate, for helping to put together this important webinar series. Last week, we marked 5 months since Hamas carried out the deadliest terror attack in Israel's history. Following that day, Israel has been engaged in war, primarily against Hamas in the Gaza Strip, but also against Hezbollah in the north and other Iranian proxies, such as the Houthis in the south, which has turned into an international crisis. This war has not only brought regional challenges for Israel, but also has increased international tensions and pressure on Israel, as well as domestic tensions within Israel. We are honored and happy to have with us today a dear friend of ours, Haaretz journalist Amir Tibon, who will be able to share and reflect on the current moment and the recent developments, not only from the perspective of a journalist, but also from a personal perspective. Amir is a diplomatic correspondent and the former Washington, D.C. correspondent for Haaretz. His writings on Israel and the Middle East have appeared in The Atlantic, The New Yorker, Foreign Affairs, and other leading U.S. publications. Amir lives in Kibbutz Nachal Oz, even though I am not sure he currently resides there. And Amir, you can elaborate on that, since, as we know, Nachal Oz was one of the kibbutzim attacked on October 7th. And I'm sure that most, if not all of us, read the article in The Atlantic shortly after the attack on October 7th, and then in the Times of Israel and other publications. And we will share some of those links to those articles in the chat shortly. And, those stories share Amir and his family's incredible survival story from October 7th. So before I pass it over to you, Amir, a bit of housekeeping. Amir will begin by sharing some of his reflections of the past few months and provide an overview of the current situation in Israel and of the war. I will then follow up with a question or two, and for the last half hour or so, or 20 minutes, we will be taking questions that come in through the Q&A. I know some have submitted questions in advance, but if you have questions at any point, please submit questions through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, as we hope to take as many questions as possible. I'd also like to note that this call is being recorded and closed captioning is available as well. Amir, I want to pass it over to you. We're honored and happy to have you with us today. And it's not a normal happiness, but rather a happy that you are safe and able to speak with us today. So I'll pass it over to you. Thank you for being here.
Okay. Thank you so much, Adam, for the introduction. And thank you for the JCRC for hosting this conversation today. And the last thank you goes to all of the friends I'm seeing now in the chat, in the list of attendees, a lot of familiar names. A big hug from here in Israel. I'm speaking with you, well, here it's the evening. So, this evening, not from my home, because nobody right now is living on the premises of Kibbutz Nachal Oz, which had been my home, my family's home, and the home of approximately 450 people who lived in the kibbutz until October 7, when we were attacked by Hamas. And I'll talk a bit about the events of that day in a second. But after we were evacuated from the kibbutz around midnight on October 7, everybody basically left to most of the community to Kibbutz Mishmar HaEmek outside Haifa, which is where we are centered right now. And we have few families in other places across the country, but we've basically been internally displaced people in our own country for more than 5 months now. And there is no clear date set for our return home. I was in Nachal Oz today. I visit the kibbutz about once a week or once every 2 weeks now. Mostly what brings me there is that I go to the archive of the kibbutz, which was not damaged on October 7th. And there are a lot of historical treasures in that archive, and I'm using it because I'm writing a book these days about kibbutz Nachal Oz. The book details the events of October 7 in the kibbutz from my personal perspective, but also from a journalistic perspective, based on interviews with a lot of people who were there. But it also tells the history of the place, the history of this community, which is the closest place in Israel to Gaza, located less than a mile from Gaza City. And through the history of the kibbutz, I'm trying to tell a larger history of Israel and Gaza and of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the failed attempts to resolve it. So that's a lot to put on one little book, but that's what I've been doing for the last few months. And the book will come out in English on October 1st, just a few months from now. The title of the book is The Gates of Gaza. And it's been therapeutic for me, honestly, to write it these past few months, to go back to the story of October 7 and to try to make sense of all the details and the conflicting memories, both from, again, the personal story of me and my family, but also interviewing many of my neighbors and interviewing soldiers who fought in the kibbutz on that day, and interviewing the families of people who died on that day, whether it's my friends and neighbors in the kibbutz, whom I can no longer interview because they're not with us, and I can only collect the details of what happened to them through talking to their families, or soldiers who had come to try to um, free us and save us from Hamas, and they died along the way. And also a lot of historical interviews with people who were in the kibbutz in different points in history and with decision makers and politicians. So it's a very, very interesting process to be working on this. And it also gives a little bit of a more distant perspective on the event, which I think for me was very, very important, because I'm not used to being at the heart of the story. I'm a reporter at the end of the day. I write about other people and their experiences and what happens to them. And after October 7, being suddenly part of the story was something that for me was unusual. So something that usually I don't experience. In the first days after October 7, despite the fact that, again, this is not what I usually do, I felt that it was very important for me and my family to tell our story. We had a very receptive audience in the international media. A lot of people wanted to hear this story about the family of a journalist who were barricading in their home for more than 10 hours, and the terrorists were firing into the house. Literally, our house was hit with more than 30 bullets and 2 hand grenades. And eventually, that my father, a retired general in the Israeli military, arrived to the kibbutz and joined the forces that were fighting there and made it to our house after doing a lot of other things along the way. And we went and told the story everywhere we could, mostly in English and to foreign audiences. I felt like it was an important mission to share our story with the world, to help people understand what happened on that day and what it looked like from the perspective of a family with 2 very young children. My daughters are 3.5-year-old and 2 years old. And one thing I repeated in many of the interviews is that when the terrorists arrived to our home at around 7 in the morning, Saturday, October 7, they could clearly see the baby stroller outside the door. The baby stroller of Carmel, our younger daughter, who was then 1 year and 9 months old. And had they come as part of a military mission, as part of a normal act of war, if you can even use the word normal to describe war, but still, there are sometimes rules in wars. This is a house they could have easily skipped. The area of the Gaza border is rife with military targets. There are a lot of bases and small army posts and things like that. And yet they deliberately saw a house with a baby stroller and decided that they're going to fire dozens of bullets at this house and try to break into it. And in our community on that day, in Nachal Oz, the terrorists who entered, more than 150 of them, murdered 15 people, 1-5. And when you look at the people whom they killed, in one house, they shot to death an 18-year-old girl. She was a babysitter for my two daughters. And in another home, they took a 17-year-old boy and they forced him to go with them to other houses and knock on people's doors and convince them to open so that they could either be killed or taken hostage. And after they forced this 17-year-old boy to do that, they eventually murdered him and left his body just along the road. And they kidnapped a 15-year-old and an 8-year-old, two sisters who saw their father murdered in front of their eyes and were then kidnapped into Gaza and held there for more than a month. Let that sink in for a second. 15 and 8-year-old, two girls who were kidnapped and held for more than a month at gunpoint. And I can go on and on with the stories, but I think you get the point. It was very important for us to tell it. And I have to say, in the first month of the war, I felt like the world was listening. I felt like there was a lot of interest in our experience, and it was something that was hard for me, just at an emotional level, to keep telling the story again and again. I gave more than 100 interviews, and any country that journalists from Estonia and South Korea and New Zealand and you name it. And I think today we're in a very different place. I think today we see that the attention of the world has clearly moved away from October 7. I'm being offered very few interview requests these days. The story is elsewhere. The story today is in Gaza. And as a journalist, as a reporter, I have to say I understand it. After October 7, which, like Adam said, was the largest terror attack in the history of Israel, and also the single day in which the largest number of Jews were killed since the Holocaust, the world was shocked by what had happened. And I think that Hamas also miscalculated from the point of view of how things will be interpreted when they took so many women and children as hostages. And I think this was one of the reasons, by the way, that the first hostage release, the deal that President Biden orchestrated in November, was easier to arrange than the current one, because I think that on behalf of Hamas and also Qatar, there was pressure to get rid of this stain that they basically were now carrying, that made them look honestly like ISIS. These stories about kidnapping 8-year-olds and 12-year-olds, and so that was something that I also felt obviously had a lot of impact. And today it's much more difficult to tell our story. It's one of the reasons I'm writing the book, honestly, because I know that our story needs to remain part of the conversation, and people need to be aware what happened. And that's why I'm writing it in English, by the way. The book will also be published in Hebrew after I finish writing the English version. In about 2 weeks is my deadline. After I finish doing that, I'm going to then translate it myself into Hebrew, and it's also going to be translated hopefully into other languages. I really, really hope, and I'm going to push for an Arabic translation, because I have not given up on the idea that there are also people in the Arab world, and in even among our Palestinian neighbors, who perhaps after reading this story will look at things differently. But that's one of the motivations for doing this right now. Looking at the broader picture, I have to say I'm not so optimistic about the way things are trending right now. Basically, I feel like we have lost a lot of the support and the sympathy that we had abroad in the first month of the fighting, and that really gave Israel an unusually large, let's call it international credit, to go out to this important war of defeating Hamas and releasing the hostages. I think if we try to point at one kind of point in time where things really began to shift in the other direction. It was after the first hostage release deal fell apart and the war resumed on, I think it was in the first week of December. Up until that point, I think everybody understood very, very clearly that Israel had no choice. After the terror attack of October 7, the murder of so many innocent people, and the kidnapping so many civilians and particularly women and children, there was a strong, I think, sense that this was really a war that Israel had not requested, Israel did not want. We actually were trying in the days before the war started to negotiate another kind of deal with Hamas through Qatari mediation, to basically give them money in order to keep the border quiet. In retrospect, of course, that entire thing that was Netanyahu's policy for almost a decade, bribing Hamas with Qatari money to buy short periods of quiet, was a disastrous policy. And we have to deal with that here because this is a big failure. But, up until October 7th, that's what the Israeli government was trying to do. And then the attack occurred and we had to go to war. After the first short ceasefire and the prisoner release fell apart, that's where I think things began to move in a more negative direction for Israel. And of course, if we try to analyze the reasons for it, it's always going to be a mixture of people who hate us just because they hate us, and anti-Semitism doesn't really need any excuses. And also mistakes that were made on our behalf and played into our enemies' hands. And this list is a very long list as well. I can give a few examples. For example, this event that was organized in January and attended by ministers from the government and lawmakers from Likud, calling to build 20 new settlements inside the Gaza Strip and deport hundreds of thousands of people from Gaza out of there, which is, first of all, a crazy idea. Second of all, completely unacceptable in the international discourse. And third of all, puts Israel basically in a position of not fighting for the security of our citizens, but fighting for a totally different goal, which is to conquer the Gaza Strip, build settlements there, and deport the local population. This is not the official policy of the government. This was never accepted by the war cabinet. It wasn't even discussed in the war cabinet. But of course, when you see senior ministers in the government attending this kind of event, it's very difficult to explain that there are a bunch of incompetent clowns who have no mandate for this, and the only reason that they're doing it is because the prime minister is too weak to bang on their heads and tell them to stop. So this is one example. And another example that I can see, obviously, is ministers of our government who began attacking President Biden and his administration and basically blaming them for decisions that the government hesitated to take. And it's always easier if you're hesitating to do something very, very difficult to come and say, oh, it's not that we don't want to do it. It's just that the Americans are tying our hands and things like that. And I thought that was a mistake, let's say from a geostrategical and realpolitik kind of place because of how much support Israel received from Biden in the early weeks of the war. But it was also, frankly, a moral failure. Because I think President Biden, even if we have disagreements with him, and we should not say yes to everything that he asks and says, but President Biden really, really stood up for Israel at a very, very dark moment in the history of this country. And I thought that it was wrong to return this kind of, to return the favor this way. Let's put it that way. I actually got to meet President Biden when he was in Israel in late October, the first ever visit by an American president to Israel during an active war. And what happened there is that the American embassy chose 12 Israelis who were personally impacted by the war to come and meet the president. And I actually wrote an article about it, but I'll tell you in a few sentences what happened there. I think it's interesting and shows something deep about President Biden and Israel. We were the last item on his agenda for the day. He landed in Tel Aviv. He had meetings with the prime minister and the war cabinet and the president of Israel, and also with the families of the American hostages, right? Because there were, at the time, I think 17 American hostages in the hands of Hamas. And we were the last thing he was supposed to do before flying out. And we were 12 people who just 2 weeks earlier had gone through very, very traumatic event. There were people who lost their loved ones, and there were people who participated in the battles of October 7, and people who were injured, and a doctor who treated wounded patients on that day and saw horrific things. It was a group with a lot of pain. For me, I even though my family went through a very difficult event, I put myself at the end of that group in terms of the personal trauma. I lost friends and neighbors on that day, not family members. Okay, that tells you something. And honestly, before he arrived, all of us, we were speaking between us. We were waiting there for hours because of the security requests and all of that. And we said we're probably just going to get 5 minutes of his time, and that's okay. We'll take a picture with him. We decided that two people of the group will say something on behalf of all of us, and that's what we expected. And President Biden arrived, and he walked into the room, and he went from person to person. He shook each person's hand, and he looked into their eyes, and he said, "I know what you're going through right now. I understand the grief and the sadness that you're experiencing." And he allowed people to speak. Each person got about 2 minutes to speak with him. I didn't want to take time from others because, again, my story compared to some of what the other people there had experienced is not as significant. And remember, I was locked in a dark room with two toddlers for 10 hours with no food while terrorists were firing inside my living room. So that tells you something about what the other people had been through. And I just told him one sentence. I said, "Mr. President, your friend John McCain survived 5 years in captivity in Vietnam, but the 15-year-old and 8-year-old girls from my kibbutz will not survive even 5 months. I'm not sure they can survive 5 weeks." That's the only sentence I told him. And President Biden looked at me and said, "I'm working on it. I'm really, really working on getting them out of there." And indeed, a month later, the two of them were released in the prisoner deal and the short ceasefire of November, and they returned to their mother. And I will forever be grateful to everybody who worked on that 1 week long ceasefire and that release of those hostages, and specifically those two girls. And after he went around the room and listened to people and hugged people and shed tears with people, he gave a short statement. There were a few cameras there, and then the cameras left the room, and the Secret Service started making kind of like signs that, we need to go. But President Biden raised his hand, and he told them, wait a second, I need to speak with these people. And he invited us to come closer to him, and he was standing, and we were kind of like huddling around him, 12 people, very, very close, because he spoke quietly. He didn't have a microphone or anything, so we had to get close to him. And he basically gave us a speech about grief and overcoming the profound sadness that we were all feeling still on that day, based on his personal life experience. And he told us about what happened to his wife and daughter, and I think it was 1972 or 3, and what happened then to his son in 2015. And one sentence that he said really stuck with me. He said, "You guys are going to think about the people you lost on that day, on October 7, for every day for the remainder of your lives." And I know because I've lived it. And I can tell you that it's been 5 months since that meeting with President Biden, and so far, he's been right. I think about my neighbor, Ilan Fiorentino, who was the security chief of Kibbutz Nachal Oz, and went out to fight the terrorists on that day and died in the battle in our neighborhood. I think about him every day. And he was my next door neighbor. We would see each other every morning taking our girls to daycare and kindergarten. And when he was smiling, I knew things were under control. Things were good in the kibbutz and in the region. And when he was in a hurry and he couldn't stop for a minute to chat about sports or the weather or whatever, I knew, all right, something's going on. And I think about his smile every morning. And I think about Ophir Liebstein. Ophir was the mayor of our small regional council of all the kibbutzim in the northern part of the Gaza border. He lived in Kfar Aza, which is a kibbutz next to Nachal Oz, next to my kibbutz. And he also went out to try to defend his community on that day, and he was murdered. And I'm in touch with his family, and we're thinking about some kind of a project to commemorate him that I'm involved in, and I think about him every day. And so, President Biden really, he was right about that. And I thought it was a big mistake to open this kind of upfront, politically motivated fight with him, even if there are real profound disagreements that have to be discussed and should not be ignored. But the bottom line is that when I look today at the situation of the war, it is very concerning because we're 5.5 months into it. And the two objectives of the war were to defeat Hamas, basically end Hamas's rule over Gaza and release the hostages. And right now, I'm not really sure what is the government's plan to achieve these two objectives, because after 5.5 months fighting, what we see is the following picture. In Gaza, it's true that Hamas has been hit harder than ever before. This is not the wars of 2014 and 2021. This time, Hamas has lost thousands of its fighters, and we've dismantled a lot of its military capabilities. You can see that, there's still fighting going on, but they have not launched a rocket at central Israel in weeks now. And that's significant. That should not be ignored. That is a huge achievement of our soldiers on the ground. But the government is not allowing any discussion of the political, diplomatic reality in Gaza in the post-Hamas situation, which leaves a huge vacuum, because if you don't bring in other forces to control Gaza, Hamas is just going to walk into that vacuum and take over again. And we're seeing that happen as we speak. Areas in northern Gaza that the IDF had already cleared of Hamas presence in November, we are now sending troops to those areas again because Hamas is trying to reestablish itself over there. And Hamas is controlling a lot of the aid delivery, the humanitarian assistance to the population, because there is nobody else to do it instead of them. There's no alternative government that can take care feeding people, and there's no government that can plan the reconstruction. And so what I'm afraid is that Hamas, weaker and smaller and much less heavily armed, but still with the same genocidal intentions and the same determination to murder us, will gradually take over in this kind of vacuum. So that's, regarding the first goal. And of course, Hamas is still based in the southern part of the Gaza Strip, in Rafah, where it is acting among a refugee population of 1.5 million people. And Netanyahu keeps saying that he wants to go into Rafah and fight Hamas there, but he doesn't explain, and as far as I know, the government hasn't even begun to discuss any kind of plan to evacuate the 1.5 million people from that area. And fighting Hamas within a very, very densely concentrated population of 1.5 million people is a very, very difficult mission that I'm not sure, I'm not the biggest military expert in the world, far from that, okay? This is, to say the least. But I'm not sure it makes a lot of sense, because it is much easier for the terrorists to conceal themselves and hide themselves among that kind of population, right? In the first months of the war, what actually worked for us was that Israel pushed the civilian population from northern Gaza into Rafah and operated under the assumption that most, or at least many of the people who remained in the northern Gaza and later in central Gaza were Hamas fighters, right? Because the population had been given an opportunity to leave. But if you go into an area where you have now concentrated 1.5 million people, it doesn't really make sense. How are you going to distinguish? How are you going to be effective? So that's regarding the first objective of defeating Hamas. The second objective of returning the hostages, we had a big success in November in the first deal. And again, I am hugely, eternally grateful to the American involvement in that deal. Without the pressure from President Biden, it would not have happened. But we still have 134 people. There are different assumptions regarding how many of them are still alive. But they are all still in Gaza, and from what I understand, more than half of them are still alive. And it's been like that for 5.5 months now. And I think the government had two plans to try to quicken their release. One plan was the military campaign. And we were told again and again and again that if the military pressure increased, Hamas would reach a breaking point and allow the release of the hostages under conditions that Israel would be willing to accept. And at first, we went into Gaza City. And then actually there was a deal, although I think there were other considerations at play. Also, I think, again, the public damage that was caused to Qatar and to Hamas by the fact that there were so many women and children among the hostages. But it's, the fighting was resumed in early December. That's 4.5 months ago. We haven't really seen anything so far in terms of, an opportunity to release a large amount of hostages. We had 2 hostages released in a military operation about a month ago, and that's it. And so I think the argument that the military pressure is bringing back the hostages so far has not really proven itself after 4.5 months of renewed fighting. The second thing they tried to do, which I think backfired spectacularly, was to use the humanitarian situation as a point of leverage. To say, okay, we're not going to bring any more aid and assistance into Gaza, and we will cause the population to pressure Hamas, and Hamas will become anxious and nervous and agree to a better hostage deal on terms that we will dictate. And this backfired. And, we can discuss at length whether, let's say the moral, ethical aspects of this, which is a serious discussion. But it backfired because I think what happened is that the world saw a humanitarian disaster in the making and just decided to solve it without Israel actually getting something out of the deal. And, I can tell you, I was in Nahal Oz today. I went to my kibbutz. I gave a tour, actually, to a group of important people. I can't really say who they were. But while I was speaking to them in the lawn in front of my house, and, I showed them all the bullets that the house had taken, and they were really, really fixated and they were listening. Suddenly I saw their eyes kind of like, leaving me and looking like, high in the sky in the direction of Gaza. And I was like, what is this? And I turned around and I saw an unbelievable picture. I saw a plane, very large plane, flying relatively low. And out of it, suddenly 4 parachutes drop. And they're, slowly making their way toward the ground. And it was like a scene from a movie, a World War II movie, where you see paratroopers, entering Germany or something like that. But of course, what this was, it was the aid deliveries. And to see it with your own eyes from your front lawn was, a very interesting experience. But this is the situation right now. Basically, the idea that the humanitarian issue would become a point of leverage on Hamas, I think, has failed. Because we're seeing the world basically coming in, the Jordanians, the Egyptians, the Moroccans, the Emiratis, the Saudis, Turkey, and then, these are, let's say, well, Turkey is a very problematic country, but the other names I mentioned, these are countries that we have good relationships with, and they are all now doing these airdrops and other forms of assistance into Gaza. And now you can add our Western allies French, the British, the Germans, the Americans. And soon, President Biden announced that they're going to do some kind of a, like a, I don't want to call it a port, but some kind of a naval position to also bring aid. And I saw today a ship had already sailed from Cyprus in the direction of Gaza. And basically, Hamas looks at this and says, okay, we're getting the humanitarian assistance, but we're not giving anything in return. And so this backfired. And along the way, what it caused is very, very grave damage to Israel's international image and standing, because we were seen as trying to basically, put pressure on ordinary civilians as a way to pressure Hamas. And I don't think this worked. I think actually this caused a lot more damage than good. But it leaves us in a very difficult situation where I'm not sure what other cards we have to play right now, except for repeating the threat to go into Rafah, which right now at least is not having an impact on Hamas because there are not enough Israeli soldiers in Gaza to do it. We have released most of the reserve forces that were active in Gaza. Some of the regular military forces have been sent up north where the situation is very dire. I can give you an example from my own family. My younger brother is a combat officer, a combat doctor. We're very proud of him in the family. And he was with his brigade for several months in the southern front in and around Gaza. And a few weeks ago, they were sent back to their home base, and now they are making preparations for potential conflict in the north, not knowing if it will actually happen or not, but they obviously have to prepare. And this small story about my brother is part of a larger story of Israel's current military formation. And so, this card of threatening Rafah, it makes a lot of headlines, and we're seeing every day now this back and forth between Netanyahu and Biden. I'm not sure it's having the desired impact on Hamas. And that's where we stand. It's a very, very difficult situation. And I have my own ideas on how maybe we can, improve and the terrible cards we've been dealt. But the most important point I want to make here is that from the place I stand, I think the soldiers in Gaza have done a tremendous job of, creating a better security situation. And we can see that there are many, fewer rocket launches, and that Hamas has lost a lot of its capabilities. But I think the government did not follow through on its part, of creating a diplomatic, political reality to actually enhance and strengthen the military action. And that's why we're currently stuck in this frustrating situation that I just described. I think I'll stop over here. I've talked for a lot of time. Adam, how are we going to do the questions? You want to ask me? Should I just read the Q&A? What's our game
Yeah, I
plan?
mean, you can read the Q&A. We have gotten a lot of questions through the Q&A, and I will try to get through as many as possible.
Okay.
And I just want a lot to take in from what you said.
Yeah.
Kind of taking just a little bit of a step back. Well, are you able to share a little bit? You mentioned in the beginning, saying that you're currently not living in your house in Nahal Oz. What does life look currently for those who have been, displaced evacuated either from the south or from the north? You can share a little bit about that.
So more than 100,000 people in Israel right now are living in a small room like the one I'm speaking from this evening. These are the internal refugees, as we call ourselves, from both the south and the north. What has it meant for me and my wife? Well, we've been sleeping in one room with our two daughters for 5 months now. At first, we were all on mattresses on the floor, and the girls loved it because they could roll around and get to our bed. Later, we were upgraded, and now we have a bed, and they have two mattresses next to us. For a long time, we could not cook a meal to ourselves, and now we have this tiny piece of counter that we can, basically do one thing at a time. if you wash the dishes, you can't cut a salad, and if you cut a salad, you can't warm anything, but it's better than what we had in the previous. Um, my wife didn't work for several months because her work was in Ashkelon, which is a big city in southern Israel, 25 minutes from Nahal Oz. And when we realized that it will take many months before we can go back home, her workplace, she's a social worker. So she was offered a position in the same organization that she works for, but in a different city, in Afula, which is a city about 25 minutes from the kibbutz that we have been evacuated. Um, listen, there are a lot of challenges in this kind of situation. It's a pressure cooker for many people. I think our community, Nahal Oz, has been very lucky compared to other communities. We were evacuated to hotels, and we are basically living in a kibbutz. And for our daughters and for the children in my community, this is the same kind of environment they were used to at home. So these children, in terms of the living conditions in their own home units, everything has changed for them, right? I mean, my girls lived in a house until October 7, and now they are in a room with their parents. Um, but the environment around them is actually quite similar to what they knew from home. If you've been to one kibbutz, in a sense, you've been to all of them, even though, kibbutzim can differ on 100 different things. But this idea that there are these small, alleys and no cars and a lot of trees and a lot of open lawns and the cows in the cowshed and the donkeys in the petting zoo and stuff, that's the same basically. I think friends of mine from other communities who were evacuated to hotels are in a much more difficult situation. The hotels, you have more comfort in the room itself. The beds are neat and the shower is new and a lot of stuff like that. And sometimes you have a small refrigerator or something in the room, like a mini bar. But you're in a hotel. And when you go out, a lot of times, you're like, it's not an environment that's really inviting for children. So yeah, listen, this is a difficult time. And I will say one last thing. There are also evacuees from the north where we are right now. And as bad as our situation is, they are in an even worse predicament because we don't know when we're going to be able to go back home. It will take many, many more months. Nahal Oz, when I visited today, it's still a war zone. You hear the planes and you hear the artillery and you hear the gunfire and it's all right there. It's not a place to bring children, and also none of the damaged homes in the community have been repaired yet. When I go into my house and I go, like I told you, about once a week, every time I see the same window with the bullet marks and the same door with the bullet marks and the same corner where the hand grenade exploded, nothing has been fixed. But at least we see the military operating in Gaza. We see Hamas losing many of its capabilities. We have some sense of maybe hope that we'll be able to return some point. For the people in the north, there's nothing. Nothing. They have no plan, no answers, no schedule. It's a very, very difficult situation over there.
Thank you, Amir. Yeah, I mean, thinking about the challenges that Israel faces both from the north and the south, and the people who are, displaced from their homes, is very concerning to a lot of us here, and thinking of a lot of the families and friends that we all have in Israel. So there was a couple of questions asking about how can diaspora Jewry help Israel. And we talk. There's a lot of we know right now there's a lot of calls for ceasefires.
Yeah.
Can you maybe talk a little bit about the sentiment within Israel right now? What do Israelis want to see right now in terms of internal policy, perhaps? What do you hear, and what do you feel that Israelis want to receive from the international world and specifically also from diaspora Jewry?
Okay, so I'll divide. This is
Yeah.
this is not a question. This is
No.
a series of questions, my friend,
Yes.
but I'll try to answer them one by one. I think most of the public did not want a ceasefire in the first months of the war, for obvious reasons. I mean, we felt like we had now to go and fight and defeat Hamas, and there was a consensus around this. I think in the last 2, 3 weeks, something has changed in the conversation, which is that, in a sense, we're not really running a war right now. I mean, in northern Gaza, we are maintaining a very strange status quo in which we are trying to stop Hamas from reestablishing itself. Hamas is trying to reestablish itself. And soon there's going to be this American docking point. And I mean, there is a lot of fighting over there. I'm not sure you can call it a war per se. And then in the southern part of Gaza, there's a big operation in Khan Yunis that has been ongoing for several weeks. And there's this tense question about Rafah, which right now we have not sent enough forces over there to attack that city. And then people are saying, wait a second, if this is not a full-scale war anymore, and we're not touching Rafah, and we're not presenting an alternative in the north to Hamas, then maybe it's not such a bad idea to take a break for now, for a few weeks, if it brings us back the hostages. Now, I think people here, most people will not support a deal that says, kind of like, word for word, the end of the fighting, total ceasefire. I think most of the public does not want that. But if there is flexibility created by the Qatari mediators and the Egyptians and the United States for a temporary ceasefire, but a longer ceasefire than the previous one, which was just 1 week. Let's say 6 weeks that's what I think has been discussed right now in the talks. And it actually brings us back dozens of people alive. I think at the end of the day, there will be support for it among the Israeli public, because right now what we're seeing, in a way, is the worst of both worlds. We're not pushing full scale ahead, and at the same time, we're also not getting back hostages. And on top of it, the gamble that was put on the humanitarian aid aspect backfired. So that's why I think there is more of an openness now for temporary ceasefire, not the total end of the war. Regarding what we would expect from the world, from the United States, well, obviously, I think the United States so far has provided very, very important supports to Israel, starting with the first days when President Biden sent the aircraft carriers to the region and told the Iranians and Hezbollah to stay out of the conflict and not try to use the opportunity to open a second front against Israel. And by doing that, President Biden saved thousands of lives. This was very, very important. And of course, the United States supported Israel in the UN Security Council several times, vetoing decisions for a ceasefire, and has supported our attempt to deal with the unfair and the unjust persecution of Israel at The Hague. And of course, in terms of weapon deliveries, I think the Biden administration has eclipsed any other administration by now with all the arms that it has sent to Israel. And again, this is one of the reasons why I just feel it is wrong for Israeli politicians to try to turn Biden into an enemy and to attack him and to use him as an excuse for their own failures. Because if it was not for him and his support, we would have been in a very much, just a much, much more difficult situation right now. Regarding the American Jewish community, so here I have two messages to try to send from the place where I'm sitting right now. One message has to do with internally within the Jewish community, and the other message is more broadly in the US. I'll start with the second one, more broadly in the US. I think the most important thing is to just keep telling our story. Keep reminding people what happened on October 7th, what Hamas did, what happened in these communities along the border where innocent people were murdered and women and children were taken hostage. keep telling the story. This is the most important thing we can do because our story has a lot of power. It has the power of the truth behind it. And even in the complicated world where we live today, the truth can be a very, very powerful instrument if we insist to use it. And I'm trying to do my part, like I told you about the book I'm writing. And, you know, if you want to bring me to speak about this with forums and organizations that you're involved in communities, feel free to contact me. But keep telling the story. Internally, toward the Jewish community, the most important message I have has to do with the philanthropic side, because I know everybody in the American Jewish community wants to help right now. Everybody wants to do something to support Israel and specifically the people affected by October 7 at this time of need. And the message I want to send you is a very simple one. Work directly with the impacted communities. Unlike what some people in Israel think, I know that the American Jewish community does not have endless resources. Okay? And with all the generosity and the support we have received over the decades from our friend in the United States, it's not, endless and bottomless. Resources have to be used wisely and effectively. And the most wise and effective thing that Jewish American philanthropists who care about Israel can do right now, from my perspective, is to support the impacted communities directly. Support places like Kibbutz Nachal Oz. Each community has been fundraising, and a lot of the communities, including mine, have the option of a U.S. tax-exempt donation through, the most official and safe channels. And when you support the communities directly, your money is not going into salaries. It's not going into office rent. It's not going into advertisements on Facebook. It's going directly to the people who have been hit the hardest and need the most help right now, whether it's reconstruction of the communities, building a new kindergarten, building a new culture center, fixing a road that was damaged, and the most important thing, supporting the people who are hurt, who need mental health and all kinds of other interventions. And the best way to achieve that is to work directly with the communities. I can send in the chat if you want to see, for example, what Nachal Oz is doing. Our community is fundraising as well, and there is an option to do a tax-exempt donation from the US. I'll send it in the chat. You can read, you can see. And one thing I can promise you, again, this is something that goes directly to the community and is not used for anything beyond the reconstruction and the needs of the community. So if you're interested to help Nachal Oz, the closest kibbutz in Israel to Gaza, you can see the link that I just shared in the chat. This is in terms of the internal message I want to send inside the community.
Yeah, thanks, Amir. There was actually a question that I just answered to in the chat, asking if we will share links to other communities, and we will do that, of course, after the webinar, in a follow-up email, sharing the recording and also links to of ways to help and donate to communities that were impacted by October 7th.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amir. And we are coming up on the top of the hour, and perhaps you can maybe provide us with a few of your closing thoughts, moving forward, what you expect to see, what you look forward to, how perhaps, you talked about how we can be perhaps helpful, but any final thoughts before we close out today?
I want to say something about winning this war, because I still believe we can win this war, even though we're in a difficult situation as I described. For me, victory in this war is not something that we will see a month or 2 months from today. But there will be a moment where we'll be able to see if we won the war. And this moment will arrive if a year and a half, maybe 2 years from now, the people in Gaza will look across the border and see Nachal Oz and Kfar Aza and the other communities that were hurt on October 7 prospering, growing, renewing, thriving. Hamas brought a disaster upon the people of Gaza. But if a year and a half or 2 years from today, they will look across the border and they will see these communities dwindling, abandoned, becoming nursing homes, basically, for old people who live there all their lives and don't want to move, but no children, no new neighborhoods, no growth. That will be their victory. They will say, okay, we paid a heavy price, but we pushed back the Israelis. They're afraid of us. They're not coming back. But if they see, and specifically Nahal Oz, they can see with their own eyes. We are so close to Gaza. I received pictures during the war from friends who went in, soldiers, amazing pictures of how the kibbutz looks from the others. And if they will look from there and they will see us building a new neighborhood and building a new kindergarten and building a new basketball court and repairing all the damages and then getting more families to come, that's when we will know we won the war, and they will know it too. And that, by the way, will perhaps even open an opportunity to once again discuss peace, because maybe when the people in Gaza will look and see Nahal Oz thriving, they will turn around to whatever remains of Hamas and tell them this was all for nothing. We got nothing out of this October 7th thing. And maybe that will cause the kind of change that we need to see for things to actually get. So that's my closing message, how we can win the war. And again, thank you so much for everything that you do. And I know you guys are also facing some challenges these days. And I want you to know we see it from here in Israel. We see it, that there are also big challenges you're facing, anti-Semitism and unfair attacks on the Jewish community. And I want to strengthen you from the place where I stand today over here. And thank you for everything you do.
Thank you, Amir. And yeah, there are many questions that I apologize that we were not able to get to, but we will send them over to Amir later on, and perhaps on his spare time he would be able to reply to some of them. And a lot of questions also talk about the military aspect, which we will delve into in the upcoming webinars in the series. So please join us for those. And again, Amir, thank you for your thoughtful reflections and overview that you provided. I think it was a great way for us to start off the series and try to continue being motivated to do our work and to advocate for the return of the hostages and for a safe and strong Israel. And over the coming weeks, we will continue to discuss these different aspects that you referenced to throughout your remarks. And I hope everyone will join us next week for our webinar that we are hosting with Sarit Zehavi on Tuesday. Again, Amir, thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us today. And again, be well, everyone, and stay safe.